Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Follycast, in which we'll be discussing, logically enough, the third novel in the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch, Whispers Underground. This is Margaret in Sutton.
Richard in Fulham.
Jan in Worcester.
And Jenny in Muswell Hill.
So, in Whispers Underground, our first full year with Peter and the Folly draws to a close. Lesley is learning magic and living at the Folly. She clearly has some issues to work through, but Peter and Lesley are back as a partnership with enough dysfunction and unresolved sexual tension for a 9 p.m. ITV cop drama called Grant and May. Peter continues to expand his knowledge of the demi-monde, with the main thematic focus this time being the London Underground and the art world. Whilst investigating a murder using a shard of magic pottery, Peter goes whitewater rafting in sewage, attends a rave under Holland Park Tube, and then gets buried alive. He hallucinates himself back into the 14th century, only to be rescued not by Toby but Lady Ty, who now expects a return on her investment.
If the first two books have been about exploring London far and wide, then this book ventures high and low as we meet the original faceless man, alive high in the Barbican Block Tower and dead in a secret Crossrail bunker. Deep underground we discover the Whisperers, or the Quiet People, the underground dwelling descendants of the navvies who built the original underground. To add to our repertoire of ongoing characters, we add Zack, an untrustworthy half-man, half-fae, the FBI agent Kimberly Reynolds, Transport Police Officer Jagat Kumar, a new river in Ephra, Oberon, who's not a fairy, and Varenka, a Russian nurse. However, Beverly remains conspicuous by her absence, and Nightingale takes even more of a backseat than he normally does. Abigail takes Peter and Lesley ghost hunting, speaks to foxes, and is given special agent duties. Okay, so what do we think about Whispers Underground?
It's noticeable that there's a lot less horror and violence in this book compared to the first two. Is that a good thing? Does it make it slightly less visceral and exciting, the first two? What were your overall impressions of the first book?
Yeah, well, I think it started very much like the other two, and I just love the underground and everything to do with it. So when I started reading it, I thought fantastic. Murders in the underground, different stations, different lines, and from the chapter headings, that's where I thought it was going. I have to say that overall I got lost, not lost sometimes, I just got a bit bored sometimes. I thought that the exploration of the sewers was interminable. that was about as visceral as it got, and it wasn't very pleasant visceral. But I thought there's what I consider the kind of central point of it, which is the incredibly clever taking of a piece of London history that most of us aren't aware of, which is the potteries and the pigmen and the navvies and the ocean, all of which is true, and creating a completely new narrative around that. I thought that was really epic. I really enjoyed it. I'm intrigued by the Quiet People. I feel I know next to nothing about them and who they are and where they came from and why nobody, including Nightingale, knows anything about them. It's an extremely interesting direction to take it in. And I just loved some of the old characters coming back, like Abigail. And yeah, I got back into it towards the end. And some lovely, lovely things coming up, obviously, especially from Abigail's last line when she's quoting the fox.
Yeah.
So it's really making me look forward to the next one.
Yeah, so I thought that this book felt different from the other two in the sense that it almost seemed to be a sort of settling into the series, almost like a transition book, because it didn't have the drama apart from what happened to Peter, which I thought was horrific, what happened to him when he was sent underground. But it didn't have the drama of the others. But what I thought it did do was it explored the relationships between the main characters a bit more. I definitely think this sort of elusive figure of Nightingale, it certainly is really flagging up his flaws as well. And so I'm still a bit intrigued by him. The things that he seems to not know about, and the idea that he thought that magic had disappeared, but also the fact that he didn't know about the quiet people. You think, is this because of the trauma that he suffered during the war and therefore was sort of really missed a big chunk of what was happening, or whether it's to point out that he is this flawed character, because being that he's Peter's mentor, he's obviously quite a significant character in the series. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I thought the sort of settling in of the relationship with Lesley, you know, she's sort of coming to terms with the what's happened to her, but she's also recovering physically and mentally so that she can actually take on roles. So I don't think it had the drama, but I think it was a very useful, settling in for the whole series, I felt.
It's funny because it's interesting what both of you said, because I don't really do notes for this, but I jot down a few thoughts, and I definitely had jotted down character piece as opposed to plot driven.
Yeah.
In the, for me, it was all about the relationship between Peter and Lesley being re-established.
Yeah.
Lesley being front and centre back in the action as she was for the first half of book one. It's interesting Jenny almost divides it into thirds, because I'd say the middle third is where I also got a bit... I was still interested in the characters, but I got a bit lost about sort of vegetables and deliveries and gangsters and fairs and things. And bear in mind, this is the second time I've read it, and I thought, well, perhaps I'll get more of a grip on that bit. But I can't help feeling that there's one whole section of the plot that could disappear and they'd still meet the quiet people and solve the murder. That the mechanism for getting them down into the sewer and discovering the quiet people possibly had one too many layers of complexity for me.
Yeah, I think the bit with the quiet people and how it came together was literally about 8-9 pages. And the whole bit being in the sewer was about 80 before he finally got to them, and then it was resolved quite quickly, and then we went back to where we were before. And I possibly would like to have known a bit more about the quiet people and know how that all happened. And it's very quickly you find out why James Gallagher was murdered, and then that's it. And then we're back to it's Christmas and Nightingale gives him a watch, and we're back to Abigail and where we started at the beginning. So I kind of agree with Jan that it's sort of like a transition novel, and then perhaps Richard's suggesting it would have been a novella with the bit in the middle cut out. So it's but I still really loved it, and I still enjoyed meeting all the characters and being with all the characters, particularly Peter and Lesley in particular, which leads very nicely on to what we're going to talk about next.
Also, from my perspective, I wasn't as intrigued by the murder that was driving the whole plot. The other two books, don't get me wrong, I don't think the author should repeat every book the same structure, had a series of deaths and murders that propelled, and you got more of a sense of urgency and there's someone out there. Whereas here, the murder was there and it sat there. Other pottery murders did not occur. So to me, it was like, oh yeah, they need to solve that murder by the end, as opposed to, I'm desperate to know who the pottery murder is.
If Zach had told them what they wanted on page 50, but it was all the fact that Zach didn't actually give over the information to like page 250. Because you needed to develop Zach and Kimberly Reynolds and everything else that was going on at the same time.
True. So Zach is the cause of it not being a novella.
What occurs to me is it's an inordinate lengths to go to identify a bit of murder weapon that you already have, because it was giving off some vestigia. And actually, if the focus had shifted more into the quiet people, who are they, why are they there, and less about still trying to identify this piece of pottery and identify the murderer, then I think it might have almost been, okay, let's park the murder to one side. This is now becoming a whole other story. But as you said, Jan, and I had to read the Quiet People stuff for the second time today, because I thought, I'm still not sure I understand this. And it took me about 5 minutes, because it is a very short piece at the end.
Tiny, yeah.
And I also worry, but I don't want you to tell me, that we never hear anything more about them, so they go back to being quiet people. I think it was maybe just a subtle shift he could have made, which is to make everybody aware that this was no longer, including the main police, this is no longer a murder inquiry. This is the discovery of something amazing that we're finding out about our city.
We're going to talk about characters in a moment, but how does the character of London fare in this book? Because really London itself is front and centre, isn't it, in this book, in terms of the history of the underground and various parts of London that they actually visit, but particularly like Notting Hill and the Barbican, and the whole fascinating thing about the fake houses that they had as steam gates and various other things like that. You learn quite a lot about the sort of history of the whole as London developed around the underground and the underground developed London. So I'll be interested to sort of find a bit more about your views on that.
I loved learning stuff that I didn't know about places that I'm actually quite familiar with. I think London is coming out extremely well, and we're learning more as we go on. And this is what I said right at the beginning, that finding that story about the ocean and then populating it with a new tribe of people is just such a wonderful way of showing how London is.
I had no idea about the potteries and the piggeries either, and I did look up the kilns and saw the picture of the kiln with the plaque on. I knew nothing about that as well. So that's, I think, the fact that I presume he's just spent his life in London and is so completely familiar with it, that I think it is brilliant that he just throws in all this knowledge. That really places you in London. You know, the different areas of London, little funny bits like when they first go to investigate the murder of James and they turn up at his place and he says, the three of us are Londoners, so we're automatically thinking about the price of the property.
Yes.
Things like that, I thought, was, rams home very much London life and the difference between the haves and the have-nots in London. The references to E. coli.
Oh, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
But they didn't make too much of it, but it was, it was brought up a few times, wasn't it? And also, interestingly, that it started at Walthamstow Market.
Yes.
So I thought that definitely had echoes with what's going on at the moment.
And that's why Peter suddenly has his light bulb moment, and they suddenly have to move before Christmas, on Christmas Eve, to sort all this out, because he thinks the Nolans are killing him indirectly by giving them, he thinks wrongly, giving them as opposed to the pigs.
But I love the response that we don't eat that stuff, we buy our stuff from Tesco.
That's from Tesco's, I know.
From Tesco.
Yes, that was one of the best things, We've got to deal with Tesco's,
But Jan's right in that I'm pretty sure that leapt out to me far more than it did on first reading. I remember thinking, and there was a few other things early on, and throughout the book there's references to Lesley struggling with her mask and it being sweaty and scratching underneath, so you're feeling a bit slightly more empathetic towards her issues with that. I may be reading too much into it, but the reference to the police unit CO19 was also,
you are reading too much into it.
You are, Richard.
if I read even more into it, the fact that the quiet people are self-isolating, but clearly they're going to struggle with social distancing and the 2-metre rule, so they're not going to be able to spend.
They've already got their online orders in with Tesco.
So they're.
But do they count as one household and one bubble? Can I pick up on something that both of you said, which is about Lesley? It'd be good to chat a little bit more about that, because at one point Sewell tells Peter that she was the best of her generation and you broke her. Given that she plays quite an active role throughout, is that fair on Peter and Lesley?
Yeah, I think it became, in this book, a kind of more mature and balanced relationship, in the sense that she's not necessarily comfortable with what she's now doing, but she has a role. But she also recognises that he has a role as at one point she says something like good police work. So she's maybe always seen him as a bit of a maverick, but she's also now seeing that he's very good at the the kind of regular police work himself. So it just seems a more grown-up relationship. They're kind of competing on equal ground now, whereas before they had kind of specialisms that didn't quite gel and used to tease each other about them.
Mm.
I also think that right at the beginning, when they were qualifying, she was earmarked, wasn't she, as being much more of a sort of practical detective, and he was much more sort of, he could do all the filing and all that. I think that Lesley seems to have carried that through now that she's part of the Folly. She's the one that seems to do her homework more.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas Peter is still conjuring up shields and doing things that he shouldn't be doing. So I think there's still that sort of fun part of their relationship as well, almost that she sort of tries to keep on track with what they're supposed to be doing, reminding him that, we're doing all this magic, but we're still doing police work. So I think they're a good team, aren't they? A good foil, I think, for one another.
It's interesting, isn't it, in that both this book and the last book, it's Lesley who makes the connections that you can work out how all the bits of the three people all fit together, like the Gallaghers and Beals and the Carrolls. It was her that, through all her groundwork, that it starts to all come together, in the same way that she was able to sort of track the little crocodiles in the last book and actually sort of work out what was starting to actually happen.
To me, this was the most interesting element of the whole book, was the Peter-Lesley relationship and how it had changed. There's an element to which I agree that it's a more adult relationship, but also there's elements of it that I'd argue are quite dysfunctional, in that Peter, I'll come back to this perhaps later on, but Peter still clearly has a big issue with her face.
Yeah.
And I found the way he described that quite worrying. I mean, it's easy because we're reading the book, so we can't see what he says. But there's one point where Peter says, and it's not the only time he says it, he says her face was as horrible as ever and glistening with sweat. Clearly is quite repulsed by that. And there's an element to which Lesley is as well, because when Peter tries to reassure her and he says, I'm getting used to it, it's starting to become your real face. She snaps back at him, I don't want it to become my real face.
Yeah.
And what there isn't a conversation, I don't think, in this book about is the conversation in book 2 about why can't magic put Lesley back to normal?
Yeah.
If all these fantastical things are happening, surely then Lesley being restored to something approaching normality in terms of her face shouldn't be beyond magic. And I wonder two things. One is this whole book is set in 1 year, so within 6 months of her being in the Covent Garden incident, she's back in the thick of things, running around having adventures. So you do worry, is it too early?
Yeah.
There's an element when she gets quite drunk at a police do.
Yeah.
Where that might be an indication that perhaps she is trying to force it a bit too much, and that there are issues going on.
There doesn't seem to be anybody looking out for her, really, apart from him.
No, there's no reference to any counselling she's having from the police or any...
She keeps going for physical checkups, doesn't she? She has to keep going for that.
The brain scans.
No sense.
Nightingale should be doing it, surely.
He's not... But she doesn't have many conversations with him at all.
No.
They're not in any...
No.
He's not the sort of person who's going to give you counselling.
No.
I think Sewell was the closest, wasn't he, when Peter took her to the pub and Sewell sent Peter away, and you felt then, I know she got drunk, but I think there was a sense there, it was almost a sort of a fatherly checking in with her, because he'd also really rated her and still rates her as a police officer. So I guess that was the closest, but I mean, that's very sort of informal, isn't it? There was no proper structure for her to be looked after.
But the speed is quite fast. I mean, she's doing a fair bit of magic. And the last book finished sort of September, October time, and we're here at Christmas as well. So the speed of her in the Folly and being part of the Folly is quite quick, isn't it? So there's that sort of readjustment to her living there. You don't know how long she's actually been there in the Folly, but it can't be more than weeks. before this story
But
actually
I guess
starts.
before she had said how bored she was, wasn't she, at home? And so perhaps that's seen as part of her rehabilitation, that she wants to be in the thick of it again.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the fact that she's doing things and being involved is good for her. And the fact that she's starting to take off the mask, sometimes for mischievous purposes, but sometimes just to think, I'm just going to take this off. It's a sense of, I don't know, perhaps this relationship with Peter, as if they're both coming to terms with it together, what's happening.
Yeah. There are times in this book when I'm not actually that much of a fan of Peter, strangely, because he's gone from being obviously lusting after Lesley in book 1 to now obviously clearly having relegated her to being a mate and not seeing her in that way. And it's interesting when Zach turns up, he actually clearly is saying to Peter, well, if you're not interested, are you okay if I throw my hat in the ring? Peter says he's not interested, but you've got to question his motive slightly. I mean, for example, when Lesley gets drunk and makes an advance on him, is he being chivalrous in rejecting that advance, or is it reflecting a wider issue he has with her now? He just doesn't see her in that way anymore. So I guess I'm saying, is Peter shallower than he actually realises?
I think the scene where she looks as if she's very keen on him is when she's drunk. And so I thought then that he was sort of not responding because he thought, well, she's just drunk. But then, of course, Molly appeared anyway. So, you couldn't quite tell what was going to happen if she hadn't turned up.
I was going to say, there are some interesting scenes where the relationship moves along, where they sit and eat together for the first time. And he actually sees her eat, because up until that point, she hasn't been prepared to eat in front of him without her mask on, and he starts to sort of see just how complicated it is for her just to see even just do simple things like eat with somebody else there, and the sort of the embarrassment that she feels about having to do it. So there are some positive things as well in how he's trying to sort of help her come to terms with what's happened to herself, but presumably also there must be this massive feeling of guilt that he must feel in terms of what's actually happened to her.
In the normal world, I don't think she'd be back on the beat within 6 months.
No, but she would also be getting some kind of support, and she doesn't seem to get any. To be honest, I hadn't thought about the speed of this. It hadn't occurred to me that this was all happening within 1 year.
From the Isle of Dogs to the IOU, in a drinker sits a thinker with a scabby new tattoo. London is inspired, but I'm tired. Let's go to bed.
I love Abigail, although she's only at the beginning, at the end. When she's in it, she steals it both times, isn't she? She's just brilliant. I really, really like that. I mean, I know she's not part of the book, but the fact that you can see that something's going to happen with her in terms of where each time she sees Peter, she moves a little bit further along the line, and he had to have that conversation with Nightingale about her. You really feel that she's going to have some significant role, but I think she's great and fun and really inquisitive.
Great addition to the Folly.
Absolutely.
Lesley brought up, didn't she, that she had concerns about Abigail, that the coat she was wearing didn't fit, and she said to Peter, do you think you ought to alert social services? And then later in the book, after Christmas, we see that she's got a brand new coat that's obviously a bit big for her. So I wasn't quite sure where they were taking that, whether she was in danger or whether it was just that she comes from quite a poor family.
She hasn't got a mother, has she? She's only got a father who, after trying to get her hair straightened for about 13 years, gave up because she just protested too much and didn't want to conform in the way that she wanted to. So maybe that'd be something to do with the connection with the father.
This is the book, I think, so far that's got the most sci-fi references in it. And by sci-fi, I mean fictional sci-fi, in the sense that I think, that variously we hear about when Lady Ty turns up to save Peter, she says, who we're expecting international rescue. which is obviously a Thunderbirds reference. There's another Thunderbird reference about Tracy Island. There's references to Captain Picard, the Doctor Who Christmas special, Tolkien, Morlocks, Ghostbusters, Morlocks,
what
which
are
is
Morlocks?
They're the Time Machine by H.G. Wells. They're the creatures that were living. They're like the Quiet People. They're underground people who are living back in the past.
That brings me to the other main thing I spotted, which comes back to the conversation we had last time in book 2. In this case, I think it's a bigger issue that we've got too much of Ben Aaronovitch coming out of Peter's mouth. So there's an awful lot of response to architecture.
Yes.
Peter is way too young to have kind of the kind of thoughts he had about 60s architecture. And then there's this kind of, well, I was going to do architecture. I think there's large chunks of the book which is clearly Ben coming out of Peter's mouth, and it doesn't quite sit right.
I think and this isn't a spoiler because I don't know, but I think the reference to architecture isn't just there to justify, his interest and knowledge in it. I think it's also setting up some sort of secret. It says, I made a note of this. I was taking the right A-levels, but I was told that my draftsmanship wasn't good enough. But then afterwards it says, I'd done my best to bury that bit of my life, and I really wasn't going to talk about it with half a dozen police listening in. So that isn't why he stopped doing architecture. There's some other reason. My suspicion is it might be his dad went off the rails, or some happened domestically that meant he had to pull out of school, and that's why he's ended up in the police. But the trouble is, were it not for the Ben Aaronovitchisms, I'm not sure I'd enjoy the book half as much. It must always be an issue with any literature, is the balance between the character and the authorial voice. And
but you don't have to write it in the first person.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Yeah. That is the challenge. Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. By writing it in the first person, which I think he was right to do, you will end up veering off into some things that, I don't know, perhaps we're being unfair, perhaps they're entirely credible things for Peter to say and do.
That's explained by the fact that he was interested in architecture and there took more interest in the buildings around than a normal 22, 23-year-old would.
I mean, it's great that he does, because it really brings particularly the descriptions of the Barbican, which I entirely endorse.
So having read 3 books now, which would you choose as your favourite one?
Oh, do you know, it's really difficult because just after I've read the book, because I've enjoyed them all, looking back on all 3, I think perhaps the first one, because it was the sort of getting to know the characters and realising that this was all about London. And I just felt I was entering a world that I'm not experienced. It wouldn't be the sort of book I would ever have picked up myself, but suddenly feeling quite comfortable in this world, this new genre. So yeah, I think I'd go with the first one because that was my introduction into this series.
I think by a short nose, number 2, because of Soho, jazz, more about Peter and his background, and the kind of slow build up to, oh my God, there's a faceless one. So yeah, number 2.
For me, at the moment, it would be number 1, but then my favourite book is actually book 5. But I'll be interested to see when I get to book 5 whether I think that's the case, or whether, having read book 1 again, I think it's book 1. Because book 1 lays it all out.
Book 5 again as well.
No, I haven't got that far yet, but that's my favourite so far, book 5, which is called Foxglove Summer.
To follow Margaret's lead, my favourite book is book 4, which is the one that's coming up. The reason I started reading the series was because there was a book called Whispers Underground, and I wanted to read that one, because it would be about the underground. And it's a good example of having high expectations, because actually, by the time I got to that one, I'd really enjoyed the first 2. And whilst I enjoyed Whispers Underground, it's not to me quite as good as the first 2. And also, not as good as Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which to me is the definitive underground book written about the magical underground. And I can't recommend it enough. If you love books about the underground, then
It's on my list.
Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. But yeah, but of the first three, I would say book two probably, because book two has that nice feeling of, yes, I'm going to enjoy this series. It wasn't just a one-off. It wasn't just a good book and a rushed-out sequel. This is building towards something. I get this now, and I'm enjoying it. Okay, well, we thought as we're at the end of the first three books, which mark a year in the fictional life of the Folly, we do a quick quiz, which people can play along with at home. It's not competitive. We'll do this a bit like University Challenge. So the three of you can confer, and then I just want a joint answer. This is perhaps a slightly dubious quiz because it's based on X-Ray, which is the feature on a Kindle that allows you to analyse the book. What you can do is run all sorts of little analyses. So, for example, the first question is, other than Peter, whose name crops up the most in each of the first three books? Other than Peter, which character gets the most mentions in book one, do you think? And remember that
I guess is Lesley, but
Punch?
Lesley.
Lesley? No, I'm not sure. You can go with Lesley. I thought it might be Punch because the story's about Punch all the way through, but could be Lesley.
Well, the answer is Thomas Nightingale, whose name is mentioned 597 times.
Wow, we were wrong.
In book one.
Well, we're going to listen to Jan next time.
Yeah, sorry, Jan.
Yeah. With Lesley coming second on 357, which I think is contributed to by the fact that she isn't in the second half so much. So I think she probably would have won, but for the fact that she's, if you remember, she slightly disappears once she's taken over. So book two, who do you think's the most mentioned person in book two?
Maybe Simone?
Yes. Possibly.
Jan?
could be Simone.
Any thoughts?
It's not Nightingale again, is it?
It is. But it's Thomas Nightingale by a country mile. 322 mentions of Thomas Nightingale. And then a distant second is Miriam Stephanopoulos with 162 mentions.
Oh my goodness.
Because I think what we're thinking of is their role in the story as opposed to Peter referencing them.
Yeah.
That's the point, yeah. And then finally, Whispers Underground. Who's the most mentioned?
Could it be Zach?
Yeah.
I was going to say Zach's in it an awful lot, isn't he?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if is Nightingale mentioned that much. I don't think he is mentioned quite as much in this third one, is he?
Nightingale probably less so. Molly less so.
Molly's hardly in it, is she? And mentioned hardly.
Lesley again. Maybe Stephanopoulos again.
Could be Lesley. She's in it more. But it's the references, isn't it?
I don't know. It's harder, this one.
Who are you going for?
Oh, great. No, we go with Jan. We go with Jan every time.
We go with Zach then. You said Zach, didn't you?
Zach
let's go with Zach.
Zach gets 297 mentions, but is beaten by Lesley with 394.
Oh, that's right.
This is a big Lesley book about
Yes.
Lesley and Peter. I think that's kind of reflected. Kumar comes fourth with 167 mentions. Interestingly, Molly gets less and less mentions, 72 in book 1, 52 in book 2 and 34 in book 3.
Yeah.
So, we talked in a couple of podcasts about the balance between magic and police work. So, in Whispers Underground, which word gets used more, magic or police?
I think police. Because magic gets used in it. They call it different things as well, not just magic, don't they? But
I don't know. Do they, having established that they are police, do they talk about them being police
really.
much?
Not, I don't think so.
I would say magic.
Are we agreed on that?
yeah,
Go for magic.
Yep, it's police. 110 mentions of police,
Stick with Jan every time.
98 mentions of magic. But in book 1, magic leads by 102 to 86, and in book 2, it's exactly even, 111 and 110. So this is the book that's got arguably the most leaning towards police work. And finally, which book is the most grisly, as evidenced in the word dead or death?
Oh, 1 or 2, not 3.
Yeah, not 3. Or perhaps
I'd say
2. Do you
1.
think that
2.
was quite grisly?
I think 1, because there's a lot of punch grisliness going on, isn't there?
And multiple murders.
Yeah, I think 1.
Could be. Yeah, okay, go with 1.
And the answer is book 2 by a mile. 90.
Oh,
90 in book 2 compared to 60 in book 1 and 51 in book 3.
Oh,
So,
maybe we're talking body count rather than...
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So it may be heresy to reduce a novel to this sort of word soup.
So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please send us your thoughts about Whispers Underground or any of the first 3 books by email to follypodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on our website, thefollycast.com. The links to all our references and books are in the show notes. We'll have a feedback session in the next episode where we will be discussing Book 4, Broken Homes.
The Follycast theme you've been hearing at the start and end of the show is London is Inspired by Cutwater, and links to their sites are in the show notes. In the meantime, we hope you enjoy Broken Homes, and we'll see you for the next podcast.